you. I'm so glad it was helpful.
Yeah, we're good friends. Yeah.
Happy to do it.
We
Thank you. Good to see you.
This is the elementary.
he is a great guy.
Oh, it's like a military
I know, it's like a
style.
military thing, yeah.
Yeah,
Like I
if you
said-
wore it, you'd have to introduce it separately.
Like I said, I took it to send it to my parents, and then I found out they sent it to everyone. So I was saying
That's
something
danger.
to like my brother or something about it, and he's like, "Oh, we know, Mom had sent us the picture."
You're like, oh my god. What else did she say?
I know. I need to put for your personal enjoyment and parental
Rhode
pride
Island for a long
only.
time. Went to-
I
went to
have
BU.
disclaimers on every photo I
I
send
don't
now. I'm
know
like,
what
this is not to be forwarded, but I thought you would find it funny.
There's
or
lots of
whatever.
places I don't
You
know, I'm sure, but
Eyes only.
Exactly. Exactly. Oh, everything is so fancy and cool.
That's good. I still haven't gotten mine since I started my job in
very
April,
good.
so and they're still on.
I lied, I have two more.
Your spares.
Yeah. And where's your job now?
Climate Central in Princeton, New Jersey. I was wondering, where's Cummington?
It's in the middle of nowhere.
Before that, I worked
Okay.
It's about as far away as you can get from
nonprofit
the
production
interstate
houses,
in the eastern
mostly
seaboard.
stuff for PBS
You know where Smith College is in Northampton?
during that
Kind
period.
of, yeah.
It's way western Massachusetts. You heard of the Berkshires?
Yeah.
I'm in the foothills of
A
the
lot of
Berkshires.
their
I did my 4 years of time at MIT, so I spent a little time out in Cambridge. So I kind of, and a couple times I went out Worcester way,
developing
and
this
stuff
is
way
on,
back
on beyond.
on beyond. Okay.
Yeah, we're
and then reporting stories as well. Sort of collaborating.
good idea.
Collaborating. Do you know Chris Burdick by any chance? He's a Thanks.
I know the name.
are like 20 miles from the New York border and 20 miles from the Vermont
So
border.
did you get the snow last week?
Oh yeah,
My favorite part.
quite a bit.
I mean, in addition to all the yeah. Did you work with
And then went up to 60 and
the name is on my brain.
ready to go away.
Sharp?
It's just been so weird.
I am Roger Mark. This is it.
Hi,
Good
nice to meet you.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Is it local lore or SQ2?
I'm doing the climate radio through Yale. Climate Connections.
Oh, okay, no, different. Sue is amazing. Meet her sometime. She'll love it.
Chris BuzzFeed would have a modern, funky card.
We make them with the badges that we have on our site, like
Little kittens and stuff.
exactly. Terrible. You need to hand it to her about the leader in Syria. Sorry. I don't know cards.
I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm in touch.
You said you live in
Sure, you were going to say something first. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. Good to see such a good turnout, and not everyone is in Peru. Some people have remained in Washington, D.C., but welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, the Director of Population, Environmental Security and Resilience here at the Wilson Center. And I'm very excited about the panel and the discussion that we're going to have today for a number of reasons. First, this work that we're doing here today and the discussion that we're going to have represents a coming together of a number of supporters that we work with and collaborators. In particular, this is part of our Managing Our Planet series, which we do together with our Brazil Institute here at the center and with George Mason University. So there are a number of students on campus who are tuning in to us right now as part of their obligation to be covering these issues and studying them on campus, which is great. This is also part of our collaboration with the United Nations Foundation and USAID. these funders help support our work in engaging journalists and thinking about why these issues are important and should be communicated to a broader audience. So we're particularly interested in these topics and delighted that we can bring together sort of an academic audience and funders from the United Nations Foundation and USAID. The second reason I'm particularly excited about today's session is we're going to hear from Alan, who's going to talk a little bit about his book and reactions to the book, somewhat of a keynote address, but then we'll also have, I think, a very fun and engaging panel discussion that will be followed by a great reception. So there's an opportunity to hear some of the ways that these topics have been discussed in a book, talk a little bit about how we can cover these issues in the media, and then continue that conversation in a reception. So wonderful opportunity to bring these issues together in that way. For those of you who haven't yet seen the book and Alan's book, Countdown by Alan Weisman, we'll be talking about this today. And I think when Alan started working on this book, I think he reached out to a number of my colleagues here at the center who had been working on these issues. And we were very excited at that point because he wanted to find out a little bit more about the community of practice and folks who had been working on these issues. And he traveled far afield to a number of the projects to find out more about what was happening. And I think many of you are familiar with this approach that we in this community refer to as integrated population, health, and environment. And Alan was able to visit a couple of sites and talk to colleagues in Uganda and the Philippines who are covering how these issues are integrated. And they are highlighted in the book. There are 2 chapters that specifically deal on population, health, and environment integration. So for those of us who work on these issues, we have a best-selling author with a fantastic book that's really going out into reaching a large audience, being translated into multiple languages, and really is an opportunity to engage in the popular discourse about these issues through a mass market book, which is great. It's a fantastic opportunity. I think Alan and I spoke on a panel on these issues in Boston a few months ago at an event that was hosted by the Nature Conservancy. And I think we were at sort of separate ends of the panel. And as I was talking, he kept looking up at me. And as he was talking, I kept looking up at him. And it's like, oh, we have lots of good stories to tell. So I was quite taken by Alan's ability to sort of capture these important stories from the ground and bring them to life and share them in real and meaningful ways. You have a copy of his bio. As you know, he's a senior producer for Homeland's Productions and has received a number of awards. In particular, the book, Countdown, Our Last Best Hope for a Future on Earth, has been widely recognized and is now widely translated. So I'm going to hand it over to Alan now for him to talk a little bit more about the book and how it has been received in the States and internationally. Alan?
Thanks. Well, thank you. I'm indebted to the Wilson Center. I think a lot of us are. So much important stuff gets discussed here, and it's a one-stop source to begin almost any story. I want to explain to you a little bit about how I came to the topic of population. I am a freelance writer, and I've been covering all kinds of stuff, but more and more over the past 20 years or so, all stories turn out to be environmental stories, and I've covered environmental stories everywhere from Antarctica's ozone hole to Chernobyl to burning rainforests, thawing tundra, etc. And my book before this, some of you might remember, was called The World Without Us, was my attempt to kind of bring an awful lot together about the global environment. And towards the end of researching that book, I interviewed someone who was the founder of something called the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement. and he was a serious guy. And he basically believed that, and I've heard scientists echo this concern, that Homo sapiens was a good idea for a while, but clearly now it's just gotten out of hand. And now we're trashing the planet so badly that the only ethical thing left for us to do, he felt, was for us to stop procreating completely. And that way, within a century, we would die off, but that would be rapidly enough that we wouldn't drag any other of our fellow species along with us. And he said, just think of it. Every decade, as there were fewer and fewer people, the world would become wilder and more natural. It would heal. The last people would see the Garden of Eden restored, and then we're done. Some other species can take over. Well, it was an interesting vision. It wasn't too different from my book, The World Without Us. What would the world be like if we weren't here and nature could be relieved of our daily pressures? Except in the moment that he said that, it was very clear to me that the reason I was writing this book was because I want a world with us. I wanted to theoretically clear us off the map, see how nature would perform when relieved of everything that we are throwing at it. And then I hope that people would say, okay, now is there a way that we can add ourselves back into this picture, only this time in harmony with the rest of nature instead of mortal combat? So I decided for the epilogue to The World Without Us that I should talk about how we might do that. And I thought maybe there's some happy medium between what this guy is suggesting, no more babies, and what we're currently doing. Except I didn't know what we were currently doing. So, and for you journalists here, this was my first journalistic lesson. I contacted the Population Division of the United Nations, and I heard these god-awful numbers that I couldn't wrap my mind around. Like a sum total of about 80 million people that we're adding every year. And 80 million is frankly too big a number for me or my readers to really grasp. But thanks to the invention of the calculator, I could divide by 365, and suddenly a figure popped out that made sense to me. And that was that every 4 days or so, we're adding 1 million people total to the planet. That's births minus deaths, which of course did not seem like a very sustainable figure. So I ended up doing this other thought experiment at the end of The World Without Us. I contacted a man who some of you know, Wolfgang Lutz. He's the head of one of the most distinguished demographic institutes in the world. It's in Vienna, and great source for you for demography. And I asked him, what would happen, setting aside all social considerations, what would happen if everybody participated in the Chinese one-child policy? From that moment on, every family only had one kid. And they crunched the numbers, and they got back and sent me a graph that showed that for a while we'd continue to increase, but then we would peak and then drop dramatically, and by the end of the century, we'd be back down to a little over 1.5 billion people. It sounds almost counterintuitive, but if you think that if we stop procreating entirely within a century, the last centenarians would die, and then we'd be down to zero, then it starts to make sense. Well, that's an interesting figure because it would leave a lot more room for other species, which we've been pushing off the planet, and it would give us a lot of breathing room. But the problem is that nobody likes China's one-child policy, including most Chinese. And still, I found, in that book, turned into a huge book. It's out in like 34 languages, and I traveled continually for several years talking to people about it. And everybody wanted to talk about this question. It was like I had posed the no-brainer. Yeah, I mean, how can we possibly be sustainable by adding that many people to the planet? And then people would say to me, but what can we realistically do about it? Because we don't want, governments coming into our bedrooms and telling us what to do and all that. So finally, I decided, against my agent's wishes, to research this for a book. And by the way, for you journalists, your editors may be on the page with my agent because, this is basically telling readers, you're the problem, That doesn't exactly win their gratitude. So, nevertheless, I figured there's got to be a way to talk about this. And my research boiled down to 4 questions. Number 1, can we determine what is the carrying capacity of this planet for our species, given our consumptive behavior, etc.? Is there a way to figure out how many people can safely live on this place without destabilizing it? Number 2, kind of the converse of that, I've got them in a different order in the book, but for our purposes, number 2 is how much nature do we need to preserve in order to guarantee our own survival? Can we even know which species are essential to us? Number 3, and this is the reason why I ended up going to 21 different countries to research this book. Is there an alternative to China? Is there something in the histories, the liturgies, the traditions of the majority of the world's cultures that might accept the idea of, so to speak, refraining from embracing so much in a time of urgency? And just a quick example that I found, the first place that I went, which is Israel and Palestine, because they have this demographic derby going on. You got 2 peoples in one land, and they're trying to outpopulate each other to be the majority. And since Israel and Palestine, both that issue and then just the religious significance to Jews, Muslims, and Christians, I figured was a way to get the emotional attention of my readers right off the bat. A Talmudic scholar there, who's also an ecologist, explained to me that, just like every other religion, Judeo-Christianity started out with a bunch of polygamists for the same reasons the Mormons were polygamists later on. It's the quickest way possible to build a mighty nation. The strategy is have a lot of children, so you're more powerful than the Canaanites or whoever else you are worried are going to usurp you. But then in the 4th generation, come down to this guy Joseph. He's one of Jacob's 13 kids from Jacob's 3 wives. And he may have been the first ecologist in recorded history because he realizes that the world is entering a cycle of scarcity. So he counsels the Pharaoh of Egypt and the Israelites that now's not a time for expanding, now's a time for conserving. He only has 1 wife and 2 children himself, and that counseling saved the situation. So I wanted to know, are there stories like that in every culture that might make this acceptable to people on their own terms, rather than saying you're wrong and here's what you got to believe now? And the 4th one was, given that the definition that we hear all the time of economic health is growth, is there a way that we could have a prosperous economy that did not depend on perpetual growth on a planet that doesn't keep growing? At one point, I mentioned this in the opening of the book, I was interviewing a guy, a Don at Cambridge actually, but I heard this more than once. He said, you're asking the most important questions on Earth, and they're probably impossible to answer. And my response was, look, I'm not an expert like you guys. I'm just a journalist, but when you tell a journalist that these are the most important questions, we damn well better try to answer them. So if you're going to be writing about this stuff, those of you who are journalists in the room, I mean, that's sort of where you have to be coming from. But once I dived into it, man, talk about learning curves. This one was a learning cliff. I mean, there was so much that I needed to learn. If that book looks thick to you, when you pick it up, you'll see that the last 3/4 of an inch is my bibliography, and it's in very small type. I had to read so much stuff for it. And then I had to go to all these places. And then also, just as I started doing this thing, I realized 2 things that I needed to learn in the beginning of the book. One is, my readers have to know not just what the dimensions of the population problem is, but how did we come to be so many? So I had to learn about that. But also, I had to answer a more basic question. Was it really a problem that we are the number that we are? Because this whole spate of books appeared while I was working on Countdown, suggesting that the real concern is that population is shrinking in key parts of the world, especially Europe. I mean, especially white Christian Europe, to be exact. But anyhow, those books are out there. And so I ended up going to a lot of places to research this. Now, I was fortunate. I had a very generous advance, and I was able to, I had publishers, my American and several of my foreign publishers, who financed this great expedition. For your own coverage, you may get to just pick one or two places, or you may do it all on the phone. There's lots of ways to do this. But to give you an idea of how I made my decisions, some of them were obvious. China was obvious. Israel and Palestine I've already explained, the emotional wallop as well as that incredible tension that population causes. I mean, to quickly explain that one, before Israel became a state, the British government had calculated that the carrying capacity was 2.5 million people for the Holy Land. David Ben-Gurion, the Zionist who became the first prime minister, argued that Jewish ingenuity could make the desert bloom. He thought they could get more than twice that many. He was sure that they could get up to 6 million there. Today, there are about 12 million between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, and by the middle of the century, our current growth rates, 21 million. And you figure out where that water is going to come from for 21 million. That's just for starters. I mean, why doesn't the Israeli-Palestinian issue become resolved? Why does Israel insist on those settlements on the West Bank? They're on top of the main aquifer, period. You don't move away from wells. Even in Genesis, they weren't doing that. India was a place I had to go to because this decade, coming decade, it's going to overtake China as the most populous nation. And of course, did I mention the Vatican, of course? And then I wanted to go to some worst case countries, a Sahel nation. I ended up going to Niger, which has the highest birth rate on earth. I also wanted to go to some big countries whose population is completely out of control, or, I mean, I hope it's not completely out of control, but it appeared that way, because these countries could really have an impact. And so I had to choose between Nigeria, Afghanistan, or Pakistan. Afghanistan was hard to move around in because of the war. Nigeria, journalists will understand this decision. To readers, it sounds too much like Niger. So I didn't want them to confuse them. So I ended up going to Pakistan, and it turned out that Pakistan was a really, really good choice, because I got double bang for my buck there, and I'll explain that. I needed to go to places where biodiversity and human population are locked in struggle, and Roger Mark has explained that I went to Uganda for the terrestrial aspect of that, and to the Philippines for the marine environment. Filipinos' diet is 90% food stuff. I went to Iran because until recently it had the best family planning program in history, and that's a reporter's dream to spring a surprise like that. A Muslim nation, and one that has been called part of the evil axis, to find out that they did something better and more humane than anyone else. And then en route, I learned about others. Somebody told me that, oh, you're writing about this, you have to go to Thailand, because one of the greatest stories in the world is how Thailand turned around its population explosion and now is below replacement rate. That's 2 people have 2 children, therefore population doesn't grow. And it's also one of the funniest stories you'll ever hear. And believe me, in a book about an issue where you're trying to tell readers the truth and not pull any punches, and you want to make it readable, humor is really helpful. And the Thailand story is one of the funniest chapters I ever got to write. It was terrific. And then I also learned that the best place to discuss that economic issue turned out to be a highly developed nation that, for interesting historical reasons, whose population is already shrinking, and that's Japan. So my big takeaways from this book, I'm going to tell you 5 of them that to me really stand out from my experience of doing this, and every one of these deserves much more consideration from journalists, from scholars as well. There's a lot to write about here. Number 1, perception. why don't we see the population problem? Yeah, I mean, some environmentalists, even though environmental groups rarely touch it, some environmentalists have admitted to me that we wouldn't have environmental problems if there weren't so many people on the planet. Well, one of the reasons is simply this. Throughout much of human history, population stayed, like every other species, stayed pretty much constant because species, people died as fast as they were being born. We had high infant mortality, like every species has. Most babies didn't make it to their 5th birthday. And people died average age 40. But then, through medical advances, it started to creep up. But then something really happened in the 20th century, which I'm going to get to. And our population quadrupled in 100 years. And that is the biggest, outside of some microbial blooms, that is the biggest, most explosive population spurt in the history of all biology. Why don't we see it? Because we were all born here. This looks normal. Traffic, sprawl, crowding, tension, etc. This is our baseline, but this is not normal. And somehow we have to learn how to write to that. We have to talk about that thing. Why did it grow in the 20th century? I've already mentioned religion and I've mentioned medicine, starting with smallpox and pasteurization of milk. We got better at extending our lifespan and lowering infant mortality. But we were only up to, we passed 1 billion in the 19th century and we were barely above 1.5 billion by the 20th century. And then what happened here? This is probably the most important thing that I learned. We incredibly and artificially expanded the food supply. And we did it in 2 steps. Number 1, we learned how to artificially take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and slather it on the ground chemically. Before that, the amount of plant life on this planet was limited to what relatively few plants that have host nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their roots, what they could contribute to the soil. We blew the lid off of what nature could do. And population started rising, even with 2 world wars in between this discovery. And in the middle of the century, population began soaring, so much that it was getting desperately overpopulated, and it was starting to bring Malthus's predictions about food production not keeping up with with population rise true. And then in the 1960s, we did the second thing. And that was the Green Revolution, which produced, through clever crossbreeding, all these plants that could produce much more grain per stalk. And harvest multiplied manyfold. You will oftentimes hear when you cover this story that, well, the Green Revolution, didn't that prove that Malthus was wrong and that Paul Ehrlich, who wrote the population bomb, was wrong? Unfortunately, Norman Borlaug, the founder of the Green Revolution, died in 2009, and you can't ask him to answer that question, but you can go to his acceptance speech when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and you can see that he said that we have not solved hunger, we've postponed it, unless the forces that he used the phrase population control, which is not a nice word these days, but he says unless population control and enhanced food production work together, we're going to be in serious trouble. And I went to the Green Revolution centers in Mexico, and that was another obligatory one. Mexico for corn and wheat, and Philippines for rice. And everyone thanked me for being there to talk about what Norman Borlaug had predicted. Our population has just gone completely beyond sustainability as a result. And we can get into some of the details about that. But think of it this way, and here's the important story. All this has involved a force feeding with chemistry. Either nitrogen fertilizer, which has lots of downsides to it, including the fact that it takes a lot of energy to produce it, and it produces a greenhouse gas when it breaks down. And 2, all those Green Revolution plants did not evolve in nature with natural defenses. They were designed in a laboratory, so they've needed artificial chemical protection. And all that chemistry, which is supposed to kill bad organisms and not attack organisms we like, that's the biggest case of mass denial on this planet, believing that we can do that. The fact is, a lot of these chemicals disrupt our endocrine systems, and they're floating everywhere. And believe me, this is one of the biggest stories of the 21st century. And all of us journalists have to be writing about that, particularly when we're talking about population, because we are now locked into a vicious chemical spiral. If we stopped using nitrogen fertilizer tomorrow, I mean, 40% of us wouldn't be here without it. So that would be mass starvation. And we're going to have to stop using these chemicals, but we're going to have to stop using them gradually, just as we're going to have to bring down the population gradually. We can't do it in one stroke without terrible, terrible suffering and calamity. And that's what we're all trying to avoid. Couple of other takeaways. This is probably the fastest thing that I know of, bringing population down, that will help bring down climate, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That graph that I just drew for you with my hand is the same graph of carbon dioxide contribution, because we're demanding it. And renewables aren't mature enough, and there's a lot of people opposing them. We're not going to be able to run our world on renewables anytime soon, and even if we decided to do it tomorrow, just mining the metals for all those wind turbines and for the solar collectors, there's a carbon debt that is going to involve 30 to 50 years before we get real zero emission energy. But what we can do is lower the number of demanders of that carbon. And that's one, and we can do that surprisingly quickly. Third thing, we can do it surprisingly cheaply. To provide universal contraception for everybody on the planet who wants it. In the countdown, I talk about the male contraceptives coming online. It would cost less per year, a little over $8 billion, than the United States was spending per month in Afghanistan and Iraq during most of the last decade. 4, one of the fastest ways to even increase all that is by educating women. Far and away, it's the best contraception of all. Everywhere I went, and later on when we're in discussion, I'll tell you the most hopeful story in this book, because it comes out of one of the most tragic chapters in the book, the one about Pakistan being out of control. Rich country, poor country, you get a girl through secondary school, and on the average, she's going to have 2 kids or fewer, because she's postponed pregnancies while she's in school, and then she's got something interesting and useful to do with her life, economically helpful for her family. Very hard to do that if you have 7 children, but you can do it with 2 or fewer. Number 5, the last one here, is that this is not a politicized issue. This one crosses all political barriers. Abortion, several demographic institutes have indicated that we now have 40 million abortions per year on this planet, even in countries where it's illegal. If we made contraception universal, access to it, 14 million is what's predicted. That's still a lot of abortion, but it's 36 million fewer. That's the best anti-abortion program that I know of. I won't go into detail here now, but it turns out that when population comes down and you want to keep the economy prosperous, got to do it. You can't have deficit spending, which takes you into endless growth. You have to balance your budget. There's some Republicans in this town who probably would like to hear those words. Personal choice. Give everybody the choice to how many children they want to have. That's a core conservative political and libertarian value. And here's from a Republican president. In 1958, General Eisenhower, who is now President Eisenhower, asked one of his Allied commanders to head a commission to study what was going to be the biggest threats, or what would be the biggest threats to global security in the post-war era. General William Draper took that commission, reported back 2 years later, and Eisenhower reported to the world, you can find his words, that by far the biggest threat to global security was going to be overpopulation. And Draper, just like Norman Borlaug, spent the rest of his year on the boards of population groups, informing population groups, trying to get this through. The response to my book, I took out liability insurance. I expected so much blowback. I expected the Vatican to come after me. You'll hear, if you read the book, a cardinal from the Vatican kind of forgets that he's being recorded. And I expected AIPAC to get after me because I evaluate Israel and Palestine equally. I've had almost no negative responses to this book. I mean, there was one guy that I got paired with on Point in the NPR program, you know, he was one of the authors of one of these shrinking population books, and he says, but, you know, like, if we don't, you know, that next baby could be Mozart. And I said, you know, when Mozart was born, there were like less than 800 million people on the planet, and that was still enough to produce a Mozart. I don't think we should be worried about a critical intellectual mass, but you're going to hear these things, and you're going to hear, you know, but technology, human technology and ingenuity can, you know, overcome all these problems. You know, every technological solution has its downside, and I can give you some more rich detail on that one. But the last thing I'm going to say right now, and then we'll open it up, is that the way to get through to your readers on difficult material or even technical material, and sometimes this stuff gets a little technical. I mean, demography is sometimes called accounting without a sense of humor, because because it's not about shekels, it's about us. But I met incredible people studying the issue, people trying to bring help in the form of contraception to people who don't have it. I met people who are suffering the problems of overpopulation and scarcity, and I met people who have worked to, you know, to overcome it, and they're enjoying the benefits of that. And, you know, you find interesting characters, you get into their lives, and readers will follow you anywhere. And, you know, in this book, you know, I've got this devout Muslim OBGYN in Tehran who is taking you know, everything from condoms to surgical tools on horseback to these remote villages in Iran. I've got a devout Catholic Filipino abortionist. I've got the comedian who you'll just have to read about in Thailand, who got his whole country laughing all the way down to replacement rate. I have, in China, an architect of the one-child policy. You know, what was in his mind and what's he doing now as a result? The Jehovah's Witness, who's head of Planned Parenthood in Costa Rica, because her church learned that the most successful way to learn females away from the Catholic Church was by telling them, what? Your church says you're a sinner for wanting to have the number of children you can care for? Our church loves you for being responsible. And they started distributing birth controls along with their evangelism. I mean, there are, you know, on a human level, you can find terrific characters in every story, and particularly this one. And if you find them, your readers will follow you. So let's take it to the panel.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was great. What I love is how you started with the big question about the big numbers, and end with the right to universal voluntary access to family planning and the right to choose the number of your children, and sort of taking us on that journey through the 21 countries. And if you haven't read the book, I urge you to do so. They're selling copies outside, and Alan has agreed to sign them for you during the reception too. And thank you for saying that all stories turn out to be environmental stories. As a member of the Society of Environmental Journalists, we really appreciate that. Feel that way too. But I mean,
politics is interesting, fine arts are interesting, society, psychology, you name it, it's all interesting, but, you know, it all rests upon an ecosystem. If it goes, we're not going to have those stories.
I am a little daunted, however, that to think that today we're going to be talking about the most important questions on Earth that are impossible to answer. So it's a high bar, but
Well, you know, I got into this question. I asked the question, can we know these things? And I'm pretty convinced by the end of my research of two things. One, yeah, we can answer this. And two, the situation is much less dire than I thought it would be. This is one thing that we can do, and it's cheap. And the benefits, you know, if the side benefit is getting a whole bunch of educated women to help us get through the 21st century and beyond, you know, that's a
yeah, it's a goal in
pretty
and of
good side
itself.
effect.
That's great. Well, I'm really glad that we have a number of distinguished panelists to join Alan today and talking about this, and we're going to have a conversation about what I'm calling the resilience beat. Today's event is inspired by a workshop on a similar subject we held at the Society of Environmental Journalists Conference in September in New Orleans. And some of today's panelists, Steve and Lisa, were there and spoke at that conference as well. At that workshop, we looked at how do we cover that space where climate and environmental issues meet this whole host of other things: disaster response, women's health, population dynamics, human rights, education, economic development, this whole bucket of connected issues, the connective tissue, if you will, of this idea of resilience, which, you know, has many definitions and meanings, but it has really caught the attention of a number of people, both in the policy community and the academic world, and then as well in reporting. So I'm very pleased today that we have represented here a wide diversity of beats, from weather to food to women's rights, as well as different media formats and models, print, video, online, and TV, who are going to share their recent experience and offer advice for others who are looking to report on this. And then also we'll have a great Q&A with the audience, I'm sure, on a wide range of topics. I'll briefly introduce each panelist, but you do have their bios in front of you. And then I'm going to ask them to talk a bit about their recent work, and then I'll throw them a few questions, and then we'll open it up. So first of all, Steve Sapienza is a senior producer for the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, which is an award-winning nonprofit journalism organization that supports independent international journalism. And speaking of independent international journalism, and as well as underreported topics, Steve is going to share with us a short clip from a multimedia and print project on Cambodia that he recently completed with some colleagues at the Pulitzer Center.
All right. Thanks, Megan. Thanks for having me. It's great to be part of this panel to talk about journalism and how we report these very important issues. The story, as Megan mentioned, that I worked on was earlier this year. I traveled to Cambodia with a print reporter from the Boston area. His name is Chris Burdick. And Chris had approached our organization for a travel grant. We give travel grants to reporters to go abroad and highlight underreported issues. And he had chosen to look at a team of scientists who were developing a mapping project to look at all the various impacts on Lake Tonlo Sap, which is the largest freshwater lake in Southeast Asia. And what they were trying to do with this map, or what they're hoping to do with this mapping project, is to allow politicians, government officials, NGOs, citizens, the ability to sort of forecast the future and try to make it a sustainable future for this lake that's so vital for the region. So just to give you a little background on how the project came together, Chris came to us with a commitment for a long form article for the Virginia Quarterly Review. And he planned to write several shorter articles for publication on the same topic of Tonlo Sap. And so we gave him a travel grant. And around that time that he was approaching us, I had recently become a staff member at the Pulitzer Center. And so I was looking for opportunities to use visual storytelling to help amplify and provide more content to various stories. So based on that, I approached Chris to see if he wanted to collaborate. And as you can imagine, a story about scientists developing a mapping project or mapping a lake in Cambodia. While Cambodia, that sounds like you know, a really interesting place to go, and it is to do reporting. The idea of kind of capturing this kind of mapping process was a difficult one, and especially visually. And when I talked to Chris about it, I was a little more daunted when he mentioned that this mapping was still a work in progress. So I wasn't actually going to be able to show anything from this mapping project. So we put our heads together. We started to think, you know, well, what are really the central problems here that this map is trying to address? And it all comes back to the environment and to how people use and rely on that lake system. So basically, we chose to focus in on the people living around the lake and the scientists and what they were doing to try to prevent, to track some of the impacts to the lake and what they're going to be able to do to forecast the future. So we focused on the scientists that were traveling there and also locals who were involved in providing information to the scientific effort, and then some of the locals who were going to be impacted by potential threats to the lake. So I'd like to roll a little clip from the story, which was on the PBS NewsHour.
Often called the beating heart of Cambodia, the Tonle Sap is powered by a massive annual pulse of water.
Of where we were going. That's sort of the explainer section of the video. But in order to make a story like that work for the editors at the NewsHour and for some of the other stories that Chris and I produced, you know, we had to find different angles to this project and how we were going to tell the story. And I think with the NewsHour, we were lucky because we're allowed, it's a feature news story, we're allowed to go a little longer. So we were able to kind of explain the science and what they were going after, but also, you know, they wanted the story to be able to relate to Americans. So we focused more heavily on Les Kaufman from Boston University to give that connection there to a relatable person to kind of guide the viewer through what they're working on. And then we also found examples of locals who were going to lose their livelihoods. So we really focused in on getting some real human stories into it as well, which I didn't show you. It's also in there. Chris wrote an article for the New York Times from the same trip. So he did the VQR article and the New York Times article. And to complement the New York Times article, we decided to do a quick 2-minute video that focused on an annual fish harvest that just happened to be going on while we were there. So we spent a day on the Tonle Sap River with the scientists and with these people who are hauling in millions of these minnows over a course of a week, except that while we were there, they were not hauling in very many fish at all. In fact, it was a very, very low catch, and many people were really worried about that declining catch. So our New York Times video was just a very short focus on that complemented the overall article. So those were just some of the different video stories we produced, and then there were a couple articles.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check all of them out on the Pulitzer site. It's a great package that approaches it at these different lengths and intensities and different angles, and I think is a great way to approach such a complex issue and a scientific, what is essentially a story about a scientific model.
It's still a work in progress.
That's still a work
It's
in
inside some computers somewhere in Boston.
Which, when we have a lot of people come to the center and talk about their models and their data, and you always wonder, how would you put that into a reported piece? And I think this is a great example of how you would do that. I'm a huge fan of the Pulitzer Center, and especially its efforts to address the challenge both of the travel funding which is a big barrier to covering international stories for reporters, but also the lack of support for global health reporting. And I wonder if you tell us a little bit about how Pulitzer does that.
Sure. I mean, we've got a very robust global health reporting initiative. We fund not only sort of traditional reporting, print journalists, video journalists, radio stories on global health, but we also fund special projects. So we'll have, for example, David Rockhind has been doing really great photo essays on tuberculosis, and so we funded many of his trips abroad to further his work and further cover the issue of tuberculosis abroad. So there's one example of a special project that we funded. We engage a lot of student journalists in covering health issues as well, global health issues. And so we've had student journalists go to Africa to cover cancer. We had a student journalist who was in India who covered dowry violence. She actually won an SPJ award and an RFK award for her reporting. So that's on another level. We're working with student journalists to get them involved. And then another aspect of promoting the work of our journalists has been, with regard to global health, is that we do a lot of work with data animation and infographics. So most recently, we had a journalist working on stories about cholera and in Haiti and in Bangladesh and in India. And she was writing a book, and we put together a cholera map that sort of complements what she's written about in her storylines in the book. But it's a visual map that helps people just go through and experience exactly how cholera spreads through different communities. In this map, you see how it spread in Haiti. You see how this massive epidemic of cholera that happened in New York City in the late 1800s happened. And I'd encourage you all to check it out if you go to our website and look at the cholera map. But we've also funded data visualizations on child mortality, another one on the really disturbing trend of growing traffic accidents around the world. So we've built a map using WHO traffic accident data, and then we fund journalists to go out to the different countries that are represented on the map, and they actually contribute different stories to those countries.
That's great. Thank you, Steve.
Sure.
We're going to turn to Lisa Palmer, who's an experienced freelance journalist who reports on climate change, environment, and business sustainability. She's currently a public policy scholar here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, working on a book project about food, climate, population, and women. Lisa, can you tell us a little bit how you came to these to be interested in the population part of the food climate issue?
Right. Thanks, Megan. I think for me, the very first climate and environment exposure I had, with the whole population issue, was at the SEJ conference when I first met you, and Jeff when the Wilson Center had a panel there, and we discussed. I think it was a population, some population.
7 billion.
7 billion, right. So was when we reached 7 billion. And from then, it was always in the back of my mind. And I later, I think last summer, spent a session at the Vermont Law School Environmental Law Center, and where I studied food production and land use. And population was the main point of our syllabus, or one of the main points in the syllabus. And then, so, further reporting on the subject, it just kept cropping up, and it was hard to ignore after that, because, for all the reasons that Alan points out, it's integrated into all of these issues. And so putting a population lens as well as an education, women's empowerment, and, looking at human rights in general, it's been a subject that I've had to include, or I've tried to include, in as many of my stories as possible.
And has that been challenging, or do you find it to be
It has. It's been, in finding a way, I guess. One of the stories that I reported for Slate magazine back this past spring, they wanted to, it was part of a How Do We Feed the World series. And, so my story's headline was something like, famine is a feminist issue. And basically, how do you feed the world is educate women and keep babies alive. And so, reducing infant mortality as well as the women's education and empowerment were big issues, because I had started reporting on this subject of agriculture and food and energy and nexus and water nexus. And many of the research scientists I was talking to, I'm thinking they're going to talk to me about yields, or I'm talking to somebody who's a lawyer by training, but also works very much on land use. And he's like, it's all about educating women. And I was getting these answers that were very surprising to me. And so I felt compelled to learn more about the population issue, because everybody that I talked to, I wasn't getting the answer from what I would expect from a plant scientist. I was getting something I would expect from a demographer. So
that's great. And related to that, I know you're part of the Solutions Journalism Network, and which is sort of a new movement to look at ways to report not just on the challenges, but also on some of the opportunities. Can you tell us a little bit about the network and their approach?
Well, I think it was the last day of my fellowship at the Vermont Law School. I received an email saying that I was was given an award from the Solutions Journalism Network, which, similar to the Pulitzer Center, provides travel funding for journalists reporting on a certain subject. And this was climate change resilience. And so the Solutions Journalism Network looks at, the stories through a very special lens. It not only has to go through the types of hoops that I would have to go through any story, like why is this important? Any editor will ask you that. Why now, and why should we care? But the Solutions Journalism Network also looks at, especially after reporting on the climate change beat for so long, it's a little bit bleak sometimes. And so by looking at some of the solutions, it's a way to engage readers further on the subject. And so looking at, so the specific proposal that I sent was supported by a Rockefeller Foundation grant on focusing on resilience. And so one of the things that I looked at was sort of, how is this approach new? They have to go through another lens of, is there evidence that this is working, or is it something that's just in a planning stage? because that's something that's very hard to sell. I don't know how you did that, but that was good. Good video, right? So, and good reporting. But it's very hard to sell. But if it's something that's coming together for the first time, and that is certainly something that's worth telling your editor or producer that this is important because this is coming together for the first time, and this is why we need to report on it now. And then, is it working where it's most needed? I was able to travel to Colombia, and I reported on a subject that is often considered around in the U.S. And around the world as eco-bad no matter what, and that's cattle, and that's beef production, beef and dairy production, as cattle are, I guess, emit among the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the agriculture system. But by looking at it, it's not only pastures, but it's the clearing of land, it's the production of methane, and the cattle ranching that they were doing in Colombia was a really new approach, and that was developed locally. And the beneficiaries, I was able to meet with many of the farmers, and they've done extensive research on this, and so it met all of the types of solutions journalism type of lenses that they were able to look at through. So it passed those bars, and I was able to go. So.
That's great, and I love the idea of the challenge of trying the timing of when you report on something, when after it's over and proven successful, or in the middle, and how do you deal with that? That's an important consideration, one that can be frustrating to folks that are in the middle of doing something exciting and want to share that story, but maybe you're getting ahead of the publishing schedule. Gina Moore is our next panelist. She's the Global Women's Rights Reporter in Africa correspondent for BuzzFeed News, and she's based in Nairobi. She was also a fellow at the fantastic International Reporting Project, which has for more than 15 years been providing opportunities for journalists to report internationally on undercovered issues. Gina, I love your title, but maybe you could explain to us what is the Global Women's Rights Beat, and and how it is connected to some of the issues we're talking about here today, health and environment.
Thanks for having me, especially when no one really understands what I do. The Global Women's Rights Beat, or at least the way we approach it at BuzzFeed News, is to look at this issue that is global women's rights, but that's a lot of things, right? It's women's education, it's women's empowerment, it's land ownership, it's legal standing to bring a case in the court of law, it's inheritance, it's in Kenya this year it became polygamy. It's a whole spectrum of issues, and obviously it's not new that anyone is covering these things. People have been writing about these things for a long time. It's probably new to have a reporter devoted to that and to looking at the world that way, not just to looking at the world by saying what's going on with women, but we had a long conversation about this title, what are we going to call it? And getting rights in the title for us was really important, because at the end of the day, these conversations about the status of women are happening all over the world, and they're happening among women, they're happening inside families, and they're also happening at governments. And if you don't understand the political machinations that are also going on and around these conversations, there's a lot of things like women's access to education that aren't going to necessarily get better or not get better as quickly, or the gains won't be sustainable, and that sort of thing. So the rights approach, which from my perspective automatically politicizes what we do, it doesn't give it one political shade or another, but it recognizes that this is a political question and that all the things that are connected to it are political as well. So women's health, for example, right? You might say antenatal care is obviously good for kids and good for society, and dropping the maternal mortality rate, good for women, good for society, good for kids, and that's all true. But there's also an implicit rights question in there as well, right? Because you're not going to bring service delivery to people you don't think count as equal people, service delivery being health services. And when you do have people who in other ways have agitated for rights that make them more equal in different spectra of society, you can push a health claim further, just, as an example. And actually there's a court case going on in Uganda that's a really interesting case study of this, where maternal mortality in Uganda is quite bad, especially relative to Uganda's own sort of socioeconomic data. And in 2009, I want to say, I could have the date wrong. Don't quote me, says the journalist. There was a small nonprofit organization, an NGO, that sued the government for its maternal mortality stats because they said it violated the constitutionally guaranteed right to life. So that's a really interesting fusion of the kinds of things we're talking about, and also, points out that Ugandan women figured out 6 years before we invented this job that these two things are obviously related, and they were not the first to figure that out either. So that's what I kind of try to identify is where those intersections are, and they're everywhere all of the time, so it's really a matter of narrowing it down. And one thing that has come out of it that I've really enjoyed, this is a slow part of it, every country I visit, this happens a little bit more, is seeing strategies that pop up from a grassroots perspective in the Republic of Congo or in Thailand, and seeing women use those same strategies, or their allies, in Brazil or in Sweden, around a given issue, or sometimes, in Kenya, we're strategizing around inheritance rights, but in Brazil, we're strategizing around equal pay. But you'll find similar strategies. And that's really fun for me, too, because women in Brazil don't know that women in Kenya did the same thing, right, and vice versa. So I dream of a big map that shows what these amazing sort of cross-border conversations have been or could be. So that's a little bit about sort of how we approach it, which is, I guess, that we take for granted the intersection of all of these things, and it's sort of my job to try to find stories that explain to people why, that show people why.
And BuzzFeed News is definitely trying to shake things up as well. And I wonder if you could tell a little bit about what's the approach? It's a new effort. How are they going about it differently than other places you've worked in?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're on the internet. It's this place on the computer. We don't print anything. We don't print paper. You're welcome to print the articles at home. It's very bad for the environment, and I think Alan will come after you. So everything we do is not only on the internet, but it's socially driven. And what that means is that we expect our work will reach people not because it's bound up in the physical paper that is the New York Times, for example, that you buy on the newsstand or you get delivered to your house, and if you're me, you ignore the sports section, and it doesn't matter because it's all bound up together. So we don't do it that way, and we don't do it like cable television where you can go, snatch your shows, and we don't even do it like Netflix where you don't actually have to have a TV or care what else is going on. You just watch reruns of 30 Rock all the time. If I'm speaking from personal experience. And so what we do is say there's a world of people who are already talking to each other about all these things that they care about. And they're talking to each other on Facebook, and they're talking to each other on Twitter, and they're talking to each other on Tumblr, and they're Snapchatting or something. I'm one of the older correspondents at BuzzFeed. They're doing all kinds of things that kids do that I don't know what they are, and some of them are things that less kids do that I do know what they are, and that are this world of social media that's like exploding at like incredibly rapid rates, right? But our big tools are Twitter and Facebook, and that's our distribution mechanism, right? So if you get the paper delivered to your doorstep, paper, not just the paper, but the boundedness of it, and the guy who put it on your doorstep, that's your distribution mechanism. Mine is I put it on Twitter, and I don't have that many Twitter followers, but they all share that stuff out and around, and it just sort of ripple effect in a pond scenario. What's interesting about that to me that I've really enjoyed watching Unravel, it was kind of explained to me when they hired me, and I thought, really, guys? Okay, let's see. Is that we sort of hope and assume that if we do everything correctly, my story will reach the majority of a global audience that cares about it, that reads in English, right? And that is so cool when that happens. It's just amazing. Things that like hit big in Japan, and you're like, what? You care about the Swedish model on prostitution? That's interesting. And that's really fun to see, but it also means that our sense of who our reader is very different than it would have to be if I was writing for a New York Times or a Christian Science Monitor, which I did for a very long time. That said, we still have our own sensibility. You won't read a BuzzFeed story and mistake it for an Associated Press story. But that distribution mechanism is part, and that conversation that we're trying to be a part of, the notion of two-way rather than one-way or multi-way for us, is important to it too.
It seems like it helps with the issue of the being trapped in sort of the traditional beats as well. Is that if you have an audience that is not you're not putting it in the sports section or the style section or whatever. You're reaching out through this multi-fingered approach that you're going to find, and you're assuming that there is an audience for what interests you, as opposed to trying to figure out the audience and then catering to them.
Well, we also have like incredibly genius level data people and coders and stuff who work for us, so we actually know there is an audience in ways that like I don't understand, and if I do, I probably wouldn't be allowed to tell you. In terms of like just the sheer numbers of people who are out there waiting for something that speaks to them to read. One sort of assumption that has data behind it in what we do is that there are niche audiences, or something that the New York Times would consider niche, right? So there are niche audiences, and those niches are smaller than the non-niche audience, as if that is one thing, and as if all niches are stacked against only the monolith of the audience. Okay, we can have a semiotic debate about that. But what we say is, okay, yeah, there are niche audiences, but it turns out those niches are deep. They may not be incredibly wide, but they are deep. There are millions of people in niche audiences. And a lot of them are reading us every day now because we bother to talk to them and to represent a world that looks like their world on a regular basis, and not just because we decided to do a 3-month project on name the big issue, right? Which we could have done. We could have done like a year-long look at women's rights in the world, right? And then I'd be out of a job and I'd be sad. But that's not how it works. That's not how they see who they're talking to.
It's really interesting. Well, turning from social media to TV news, Jen Breda is a data analyst for Climate Central's Climate Matters project, which is an NSF-funded collaboration between George Mason University's Center for Climate Change Communication, NOAA, NASA, and Climate Central to bring climate news to the public by working with local TV meteorologists, so with your friendly weatherman. A number of years ago, one of the local weathermen here in DC, Joe Whitty, who was involved in this project in an early phase, told me they were going to try to explain climate change in 10 seconds or less, and I just laughed. I said, how you're not possibly can't do that, but that is actually what they are doing. So Jen is going to show us how they do it.
And let me provide a couple clarifications. It is true I am not a journalist. It was not forgotten from the title. I am not a journalist, but work in an organization that does provide information to journalists. And I neglected Yale and the American Meteorological Society are also partners with us, so I should acknowledge them too. And it was interesting coming after BuzzFeed and all this new media to talk about your 6:30 news, which maybe some people in this room still watch. I know when I started at the job, actually, my boss is a former on-air meteorologist, and she asked us to start making sure we watched the 6:30 news because she knew a lot of us probably didn't, or the 6 o'clock news or the 5 o'clock news. So we knew, who we were trying to speak to and the kind of information. And I think, like you're saying, Megan, that how quickly, I don't think you realize when you're watching it, they're conveying information in 10, 15 seconds. And so to really get something across in that amount of time, I've really learned it's an art form. And as a data analyst, you want to do a lot of footnotes, you want to do a lot of labels on your axes, a lot of things like that, which don't really show up well on TV, I've learned. And so you really kind of have to balance that. That being said, we do also know that, like you said, your trusted advisor, your friend, the local weathercaster, you may follow him or her on Twitter. You may follow his or her Facebook page. So this information also needs to be bigger too. So if someone follows their tweets or decides to go for their Facebook page, there's more information. It's not just that 10, 15-second clip they're going to see on TV. What I wanted to show you was something that there were many components to it. One component was what we send to the meteorologists. And so this is a meteorologist in North Carolina, and this was how your summer is going to change in 2100 if climate change continues. So yeah, if it continues on its current trajectory, what's your city's going to be like? And so this was personalized. We have meteorologists in many markets. I think it's 80 markets, and we have over 200, close to 200 meteorologists. So we personalize for each of their markets where they are going to go somewhere on the map. So here's a clip, and I think it also shows the benefit of the personality of using a weathercaster to convey this type of scientific information too, which is a really, I think, what, like you said, Joe and Ed and a lot of people who started this program kind of saw that this is, this is a good conveyor of information. So. Arabia and things like that, because they basically got too hot to stay within our continent. So these are the type of things, and I think it was interesting hearing the other speakers, because we really are, even though we're working in what's perceived as a very traditional media with the meteorologists, we're really trying to embrace the other ways that people are communicating, that people are going to tweet things, that they're going to pass them along, that they are going to use interactives on the web. So we're trying to, use that meteorologist as a platform, but there's many different elements to what we're working on.
So Climate Central has both journalists and scientists. It's an interesting hybrid. How does that work in practice? I mean, how do you keep it sort of the working relationship steady while also keeping that independence going?
Right. So I'm in the TV meteorologist in the research group, and we also have a journalist group, which is a separate group. The journalists are not there to report on our research and our analysis. The journalists are there to report on climate change topics that they see fit, and as people said, all the other relevant that I am not as aware of journalist, criteria. Is it important? Is it, current? Is it, So they are kept separate. We have some writers who will assist us when we need, to put something together correctly to convey a point. Since we are sometimes data analysts and things like that, they're very helpful constructing sentences and things like that when it's important to do. But as far as their reporting, it is separate. And maybe somewhat helpful is we're based in Princeton. Most of the journalists are actually in an office in New York, so they're actually physically separated in many ways. So I think it's a big goal of the organization to keep that separate, to keep it, the journalists are not journalists there to report on what we do. They're there to report on climate change, which is the important goal of our organization overall. So.
That's great. And I just want to give a shout out to Ed Maybach at the Center for Climate Change Communication, and the work that he's doing is also bridging this gap between the scientists and the journalists, and this collaboration is quite I think an interesting project to bring it to more people in a way that's accessible
And Ed's going to do he's doing a lot of, and we're doing right now, a lot of follow-up on, is this working? He's talking to both the meteorologists that are in our program and the viewers to find out, we think it makes sense, but is it really getting through to them and registering?
I think there's an information sheet outside with some of the preliminary results if you want to take a look. Well, thank you very much to the panelists and to Alan. And I want to definitely open it up to questions. Before I do, I have one for all of you. So most of this work that we've been talking about today doesn't fit neatly into any of the traditional sort of categories, the sections of the newspaper, et cetera. You're working at the border points, which is something Gina said to me earlier today. And I was thinking about this, and I said, like living on a real border, there's some serious challenges, to being in neither one place or another. But also, as Gina said, that's where the exciting stuff happens, So do you guys agree with that? And what are the challenges, and are they worth it?
There's a woman who I quote in Countdown who observes that population is the intersection between social science and natural science. And my take on it is actually kind of the collision between them. But ultimately, to understand what's going on in the world, you have to get out of those section barriers. It takes, the unfortunate term that we have is interdisciplinary. It's way too many syllables. And holistic sounds too ethereal. But, sometimes... Well, the fact is that, sometimes people ask me, how'd you learn to be a journalist and all that? And I did go to journalism school, and I learned next to nothing useful there. But early in my career, I got to start hanging out with ecologists because I was covering them. And they were just so amazing because it wasn't just phenomena they were looking at, but they were looking at how these phenomena interact. They were looking at the connections between everything. And the connections is the important story. That's where we really understand not just what's going on, but what on earth we can do about it, where the places are that we can intervene in, in any kind of vicious cycle that's taking place. And to me, think of this not as a disadvantage, but think of it as a great advantage. Everything comes together here. And you can just almost go anywhere and start talking about everything else. So this can be written about in the food pages. It can be written about in the business section. It can be written. I actually taught a class at a university a couple of years ago, and it had a bunch of sports writers in it. Like, the scheduling screwed up for them, so they had to take my class. And I got them thinking about, so what are the sports implications of carrying capacity of our planet? And they started coming up with fascinating ones, really. Starting with, are we going to have a Winter Olympics in the future? And, there are so many ways into this. So you can start in any section and talk about the totality.
Great. Else want to say?
Well, I guess I would have to agree, considering one of the outlets that I write for, and now it's on radio program, it's called Climate Connections. But the connections piece is something that I am looking at very closely in my project here at the Wilson Center. One of the other terms I was batting around was mingling, which may be perfect for population as well, because it mingles with so many other things. But the idea is that doesn't neatly fit into one category, but that's also a great benefit because it opens us up without being, placed into one very special spot.
I think when it comes to how we report these stories, one of the things I've learned from working at the Pulitzer Center is just all the different ways that you can collaborate with other journalists and other folks on these types of stories. So you might feel, I've got this idea for a story. How do I want to tell this story? Do I want to put it in print? Do I want to put it on the web, in video? But I think we're in a really exciting time right now. There's so many different types of people, data visualization types, interactive web designers. There's so many different directions you can take these stories and different audiences that it's really a unique time we're in. So.
Great. Well, I'll open it up to the floor. Please speak into the microphone. My colleagues will bring it to you. And please state your name and affiliation so the folks on the webcast know who you are. Bekte? Ryan?
Thanks. Excuse me. Hi, I'm Brian Greenberg, and I'm with an organization called Interaction. And I think the question I have would probably be for Alan, but I'd be curious about the reaction of anyone else on the panel. And the issue really is how and whether, without meaning to discount in any way the importance of population growth as an issue environmentally, it seems to me that the issue is really more one of ecological footprint of respective populations, and that it isn't so much carrying capacity, it's the distribution of consumption of the Earth's resources. And if one imagines for a moment a population that is more or less static, one is still faced with an industrial economic system, which, as you nicely pointed out, is committed to endless growth. And we seem to be in a predicament where population growth and economic growth play off against one another and justify one another. And that leads me to the suggestion that the most heretical idea that we could consider is of a steady state, and that we don't solve the problem with declining population in a globally expanding economy. And there is, of course, a very refined literature and area of thinking around what steady state would involve. But it would involve unraveling a lot of the economic system that we depend on. And that is a genuinely heretical idea.
I think there were kind of two questions implicit in all that. As to the second one, steady state, if we bring our population, determine what's a safe level for a population. And to me, an easy way to look at that is, stop force feeding the food supply with chemistry, because it's coming back to bite us. Then we'll get down to a level that would be much more manageable on this planet, and we would need to have our economy become a steady state economy. Now, it's heretical to think that we're going to throw out the bastards from Wall Street tomorrow and the Federal Reserve System, and we're going to institute some kind of socialized sharing of all the wealth. Humanity's never shared the wealth. Maybe a couple of potlatch societies have, but frankly, they really didn't, if you get to know what they were about. But gradually, our economy would devolve into something much saner. As I mentioned, of course, we're talking shorthand because I don't have time to explain the entire economics chapter of my book in this session. But to stop growing population-wise, which we're going to have to do one way or the other, either we're going to manage it gracefully or nature's going to do it to us, we're going to move to a much steadier state because we're not going to be able to keep growing. And there are a couple of terrific benefits from that. There's one thing that I'll tell you about, you will find in the economics chapter, is this wonderful Japanese economist, Akihiko Matsutani, who's no radical. He's not heretical at all. He's in a major policy institute. But he's written a book that's driving everybody crazy there because he's talking about the economy of shrinking populations. And he points out that this whole bugaboo of, oh my God, what's going to happen to, if the economy stops growing because GDP is going to drop, and then, how will we support everybody and all that? Yeah, GDP drops when you have fewer people in the country, but per capita income doesn't. In fact, turns out that wage earners, suddenly, because there's fewer of them being born, they're more valuable. So wages don't drop. And suddenly we find a leveling out of the economic system and this incredible disparity that we have because companies start pampering their wage earners. They don't want them to flee to somebody else. There are some interesting approaches that I was delighted to find out in the course of my research. I'm no economist, but you know, I live in the economy just like we do. The other aspect of your question brought up kind of, though you didn't phrase it this way, it's always lurking there. Well, you know, is the problem really population or is it just consumption? And can't we just be better about distributing the wealth and not consume so much? As Paul Ehrlich pointed out to me once, he says, you know, nobody's invented a condom for consumption yet. And I don't know how to solve consumption. I mean, Bill Maher asked me that question at his television show, and I said, hey, if I knew how to solve consumption, I would have written that book. But the fact is, the two biggest products that are consumed on this planet, we're all addicted to. One of them's food. You try consuming less. I mean, yeah, maybe you can eat less meat, but it takes right now nearly half this planet just to support the food production of one species. That's us. And even if we all became vegetarian, which is not going to happen, unfortunately, it still would be enormous. The other one is energy. And we all got here today through some conveyance that coughed something up into the sky. You know, lowering my footprint, it just, try as I might, and I got examples in the book of people who have tried like crazy. Turns out that the biggest way that you can lower your footprint is by not having so many descendants, and that's why I consider this to be one of the most important things that we can do, is convince people it's in their best interest, and as well as their country's best interest, but it's in their own personal best interest to have fewer children. It'll be easier to raise them, educate them, be less of a burden on their pocketbooks and on the planet.
Another one, Melody up here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Melody Schreiber at the International Reporting Project. I'm really excited to see Gina on this panel, and my question is for the journalists. Earlier, I was speaking with Gina about how she's kind of a one-man band on her beat and on her continent. And so my question is, and also for freelancers, how do you get support? How do you convince your editors that this is really important, especially when you're talking about different topics and how they relate? And how do you approach those topics with sensitivity? Often you're talking about fraught topics, even contraception can be difficult to cover. So how do you do that?
I'm sneaky. I need to be less sneaky now, but I've always been very sneaky. Because before I joined BuzzFeed almost a year ago, I worked as a freelancer for 7.5 years, mostly out of Africa, largely because organizations like the International Reporting Project and the Pulitzer Center exist, and you can kind of partner with them as like the good guys who sort of get it and agree that like, all right, well, here's what we're going to try to do, but we're going to actually talk about it this other way, so I don't have to say basic health infrastructure to an editor who then goes, what? We're finished. Like, I will never work with you again. And I was thinking about this when you asked your question, Megan, actually, a story that I did in the Republic of Congo, which I call for Americans the other Congo. Congo-Brazzaville, their maternal mortality rate dropped dramatically over a decade, and it turned out that much of the dramatic drop, it was about 65%, much of that drop had occurred in a 2 to 2.5 year period. And there's, data delay problems and all that stuff, but it was quite significant, and it fell, and it really fell, right at the end of the window that we were looking at. Fell so much that UNFPA gave their guy there an award, and I thought, aha. And it was what I found out when I did my pre-reporting. This is one of the stories that I did last year when I was a new media fellow doing global health with the IRP, with the International Reporting Project. And when I was talking to people before I went, they said, "Oh, free cesarean sections explains it because we had all these complicated births, women dying in births. Now the cesarean sections are free." And what the system had been, I found out when I was there, before was that if you had a complication in birth and you needed to have a C-section, someone would go out and tell your husband, presumably, hopefully, waiting, in the waiting room, though probably not, so where did he go, and get him on the phone and all this stuff, and say, "Okay, great, we need a couple $1,000s in order to finish the procedure. We'll keep going when you get back. Let us know, how quickly you can come." And women would literally bleed to death on the table because their families didn't have the money to pay for this emergency in total all of a sudden. So when cesarean sections became free, there was this dramatic drop. But the other thing that I found, and this is why field reporting is so important, and places like the International Reporting Project are so important for funding it, is that's great. Free cesarean sections is great. The reason that was able to work, this is in my estimation, but is partly because the basic health infrastructure and the referral system for pregnant women with complications in Congo-Brazzaville was so tremendously smooth. And that's partly a weird quirk of their demography. Unlike a lot of other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, most of their population is concentrated in 5 urban areas, and there's almost no one in between these urban areas. And those who do live there have great challenges with health service delivery and that sort of thing. But it was fairly easy because people were devoted to it. They'd set up a system for it, and the roads were good to get women who everybody thought might have a problem down to the, one of 3 hospitals that does the C-section that is now free. And so you could have all the free C-sections you wanted, but if you didn't have that underlying system, which no editor would have ever commissioned a story on, let me write about the basic health infrastructure of the Republic of Congo. The warring one? No, the other Congo. Wait, what? You're finished. And so you need the pre-reporting. You need the simple thing that it's about, that you can get buy-in from an editor on. It helps if you've worked with the editor and you know them, right? Of course, because you know what they'll go for and what they won't. But you also have to be open to these surprises, and then finding a way to make this about more than one thing, right? Like, we're trained as journalists that, that story meeting is what's this about? And if you can't winnow it down to one thing, then you haven't done all your reporting, or you don't really know, what your story is yet, or whatever. I've always believed that no story is about one thing. And if it's only about one thing, then I don't want to write it because I'm already bored. But figuring out how to hold that all together in a way that everybody can trust, that the editor can trust the process going through, and we can all trust that the reader's going to follow. And, it's why narrative and characters and the people you were talking about in the book ending your explainer section are so important too. But that's what I mean by being sneaky.
Lisa or Steve, do you want to add anything?
I think I haven't contributed to a lot of different outlets, but the ones that I do contribute to, I'm very careful to watch their stuff and see exactly how they present things and conform really to their approach. And I do agree that tackling complex issues is definitely much more engaging as a journalist and where I want to be as well. But you definitely want to avoid the jargon and the types of theories and things that are just going to really confuse an editor and scare them off. So.
I mentioned that my agent didn't want me to do this book. And I took that to heart. And so believe me, I tried to find something else to write, and I couldn't because I kept coming back to this, and people kept asking me. So when I started to write a proposal, I started thinking, okay, so is there a problem with population? Like, who would object to us trying to deal with population? It turns out that there's a lot of objectors out there. Economists, the flip side of what I said before about wages is that the real reason economists like big populations is that it keeps labor cheap. They want a bunch of poor people fighting over miserable salaries. So I started, feminists. There was a huge feminist movement thinking that any population program that had to do with the environment was just one more thinly disguised pretext for taking control of women's bodies and forcing sterilization on them and all that. And I could go down the list here But that's exactly what I did in my book proposal. I went down the list of all the tension areas. Editors love tension. That's great story stuff. And there was an auction for my book. I had publishers fighting over this thing just because I had a lot of human conflict in it. And, you know, a little research, I hadn't gone anywhere in the world for this book yet, but a little research indicated some of the settings that I would be able to find out where these tense battles were playing out in an interesting way. You know, I mentioned Israel-Palestine. That one always gets people's attention. It doesn't take, you know, a little ingenuity in writing a really good memo to your editor on this one. It's almost like shooting fish in the barrel. There's so much to work with.
All right, in the back.
Hello, my name is Harlan Cohen. I'm speaking on my own behalf. I want to thank the panelists for the very interesting presentations. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that cattle ranching, cattle produce millions and millions of tons of manure each year. In Colombia, millions of tons go down into the Magdalena River, the Rio Sino, the Canal del Dique, and enter the marine environment. The world's oceans cover 70% of the Earth's surface and represent perhaps 95% of the Earth's biome. My question is, would any of the panelists want to comment on how does one encourage shifts in culture such that established norms and groups that oppose, who feel threatened by certain things, give way? And I'm thinking of groups that are threatened by contraception, even in this country, and in this country now there's groups that are threatened by women having even primary, but secondary educations. How do you get at getting cultural shifts to undercut those opposing forces? Thank you.
I don't want to monopolize, but I can respond to both of those. You want me to speak? I'm supposed to use this mic. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. 2 points. First of all, the one about food, that's going to be one of the enormous battlegrounds of the 21st century. And we all got to be paying attention to it, and we all got to be writing about it, because food is not grown on this planet to nourish people. Food is grown on this planet mostly to make profit. And meat is very profitable. And carving up the pampas of Argentina that used to produce the best meat to grow soybeans to produce more meat is crazy, but we're crazy now. And because it's about greed and profit. And force feeding the food supply with chemistry that we know is screwing up. I've been researching this for the past 2 months, and believe me, it's not a walk in the park. And I'm not sure how to write about it yet. I'm working on this, and it's going to take a lot of work. But that's going to be one of our big jobs. The other part of your question was, having to do with convincing people, in countries that don't want to educate women, or give them a secondary education. I'm going to tell you that hopeful story that's in Countdown. And this is couched in Pakistan, which basically fulfills all of President Eisenhower's fears about global security. And I mentioned global security before because that's really a way you can get through to people. Everybody's insecure about our global security now. Pakistan's got nearly 200 million people in a country that's the size of Texas, which has only 26 million people. And by the middle of this century, at current growth rates, it's going to have nearly 400 million. That's a lot more than the United States currently has, and it'll still be the size of Texas. And it can't possibly employ them all. So it's got all these angry, frustrated young men who are unemployed, and that's why it's become a cradle for what we call terrorism here. And it's a nuclear power. I mean, it's a scary place. Every day that I was there, mayhem broke out. Grenade battles in Karachi, which is considered a more peaceful city than some others. And the two guys from UNEP, World Wildlife Fund Project, to save the mangroves around Karachi Harbor, how I went to interview, I got there a day late because they were found tortured and floating in the harbor because they'd been assassinated. Someone else wanted to cut those mangroves and sell the wood. So that's where Pakistan's at. But 3 kilometers away from where I spent the day with the grieving families of those guys is a slum called Machar, whose name means mosquito, and that kind of says it all. And it's nearly 1 million people living in utterly horrific conditions. And the only thing that they can do for a living is peel shrimp that come in at 3 o'clock in the morning. So they have a lot of kids because kids have little fingers and they're good shrimp peelers. And it's a very conservative area. And anyhow, in the midst of this place is a school that is so lovely that you would happily send your kids to this school. And the reason it's there is that about 18 years ago, a bunch of 6, I think, Karachi businessmen were out to dinner, and they were just talking about how their country was going down the tubes. And one guy said, why do I even bother to send my kid to school? The teacher only shows up 1 day a month to get a salary. And somehow over dinner, they decided that instead of whining, they were going to do something about it. And what they decided to do is start their own parallel school system, private schools, but in the poorest parts of rural and urban Pakistan. And this was one of their first schools. And it was just this beautiful place. And these kids, they come in at 8 o'clock in the morning, they're taken to the bathroom to wash their hands in antiseptic soap because they're cut from peeling shrimp. They wanted their schools to be 50-50, male and female, because they wanted boys growing up alongside girls, learning to respect them. The way to convince people to send their daughters to school was to have only female teachers, because people were worried that a male authority figure like a teacher might take advantage of a girl. They talked to the madrasas, and they got cooperation for this under those strict rules. They weren't allowed to talk about things like birth control, family planning. But in the secondary school, which I also visited, which was lovely, computers, laboratories, and stuff like that, one of the first things that happens is that they ask a kid, what would you like to do with this education of yours? And, it's a typical answer you hear anyhow. Boys want to be engineers, they want to be pilots, they want to be doctors. Girls want to be doctors or nurses or teachers or flight attendants. But they pair every kid up with a mentor who's in that professional role, same sex. And what happens with the girls is that they don't get to talk about family planning, but they see that this woman who has become their role model to exercise her profession, she only has 2 children, or sometimes even fewer. And one of the founders said to me, and that's how we are going to change Pakistan. And I said, yeah, but what about the Taliban? They shoot girls go to school. They blow up schools. He said, we dealt with the Taliban right away. I said, like, how? And they said, we just told them, for every one of our schools you blow up, we promise you we will build 5 more. And this past year, they opened their 1,000th school. So this can be done. It just takes some real creative, visionary thinking, and that wasn't the best example I've ever heard.
Lisa, did you want to say anything about cattle ranching?
Well, I guess I think for me, what I have reported on cattle ranching is probably this much in terms of what can be reported on cattle ranching. But one of the things that I was looking at was a way and a system of sustainable agriculture in which there were no added inputs from chemical companies, which the manure was kept under an agroforestry system, which was within a few hours was broken down underground, and so that it wasn't this big sort of CAFO type structure that we're familiar with here in the U.S., and that the efforts that they were making in parts of Colombia where it's possible is they were trying to do it under agroforestry as well as by enriching pasture land, so they weren't putting it with, spreading it with urea and so on, which is a chemical that contributes to climate change as well. So I think that there are solutions like that that exist and that are applicable in parts of the tropics, but it's not a solution that we can just spread willy-nilly here and there where we think it should be used. It's something that I think for the scientists that I've studied, it had to go under these bars, like, is there evidence this is working? Is it being used where it's most needed? Who are the beneficiaries and how are they used? And so by actually seeing it, reporting it, being there was really key to being able to tell that story. So I do want to follow up on one point that you made about schools. One of the key pieces that I've noticed in parts of Africa that are having some of these schools for higher education for girls especially is a co-learning experience with their families. So some of the schools will be having once a quarter or once a month, the family will come to school for a day. Again, a lovely building or a lovely setting, and they'll be working on a homeschool project or a homework project together. That has been a successful component to creating more of a social change in which they see, improved economics for their family, so they get both supports from the mothers who are letting their daughters go to work when they could be, go to school when they could be working at home, as well as the fathers who are, having to pay for this education and wondering whether it will pay off. So.
Can I just say one thing really quickly? It's a minor point, but it's an important one I think worth making. I think the much sort of more useful, maybe more interesting way of asking that particular question is not what can be done to shift cultures toward X or Y or Z, but what could be done to support the people who are trying to shift a dominant culture where they are toward P or Q or R. When you don't bring that out, sometimes you end up with these very well-intentioned, top-down, utterly irrelevant to possibly harmful sort of interventions that all mean well but end badly.
Yeah, context is always important. Yeah, Kim? Over here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kim Lovell. I'm with the Sierra Club's Global Population and Environment Program. I had two quick questions. One being, how do you take issues like global population growth, like climate change, these sort of very long-term issues, and make them news or make them newsworthy? A lot of people don't like hearing about the newest report that was released. So beyond that and beyond the International Fill in the Blank Day, what are some of the ways that you really make these issues newsworthy for your readers? My second question is, how in your reporting do you sort of grapple with this phenomenon that as folks have fewer children and as communities develop, they often use more resources, contribute more to climate change, adopt some of the lifestyles that we have here in the highest consuming countries as they sort of move up this ladder of development in ways that we really want. We want folks to have the right to access a lot of the services that we have, or have some of the kinds of rights in our day-to-day lives there. But as folks move up that ladder, they are consuming more and contributing more to this sort of global environmental issue that we're talking about. So how do you kind of grapple with that phenomenon in your reporting as well? Thank you.
Answer the quicker question.
The easier one.
To fighting poverty, global poverty. Since we're really working with, because we're working with local news and we're working with, we have to shift what we thought we were going to do a lot to what's going on, and especially because we're putting it in the context of climate arrow to weather. It's probably going to be the hottest year on record on the world. How do you talk about that in December in North America? It's tough, and you get reporters going out shoveling snow and talking about, it's the hottest year on record. So you have to be conscious of things like that and how to work them. Last week we shifted and we looked at climate change, why Great Lakes snow is greater because of climate change. We were going to do something else, but we said, oh my God, it's going to snow a lot. And how do we find the climate element to this? So for us, since it is really a kind of a bite-sized morsel, and it's not like we're going to have to produce a report, I have to go out and find some data that represents this, and we do go for, I found a research report that said that this was happening, and then I went and found the data. But we find in ours, because we are working with local news and we're working with, last week we thought all they're going to be talking about is travel. that's all they're going to, everyone, because we send it out on Wednesday night, they're going to be standing on the side of the highway talking about Thanksgiving travel. How can we talk about, so we talked about carbon emissions from travel. So we find we have to shift. We often have to erase something off the board and put something new on when a storm hits or something like that, to make it relatable, because that's really our goal, is to make climate change really relatable to what you're experiencing. But it still does have those challenges. Like, we are still grappling now in December with how do we talk about the heat of 2014 in the middle of the winter in the US. It's not always easy to do, so.
Lisa, the Climate Connections work tries to do this a little bit.
It does. I mean, I think for the pieces that I produce for Climate Connections, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a project of the Yale School of Forestry and the Environment called Climate Connections, and it's on public radio stations nationwide. I think they're up to maybe 75 or 80 stations. And growing, as it just launched a couple months ago. The piece is, it's just climate is connected to us in our everyday lives, more frequently than we think. And so that's what I do, is write about these pieces all the time. I think for us, though, and for the best way that I can connect with my editors and readers, mostly, is just getting out there and reporting and finding a good story. And that's where the human angle is always going to win out over a report launch or what certain day. I mean, in fact, if it's a certain day, there's pretty much guarantee I'll never report on that. So, or if, that's just kind of something I just don't do. But if there's a certain human involved at the center of this that will resonate with the reader or resonate with the point, that will be a compelling way for me to get into the story.
I'll take on the hard part of your question. Just by being aware that there is this paradox that as life becomes more manageable when there are fewer people, then life becomes more affordable, and then those fewer people become more prosperous because they're not dividing the pie between 8 kids, and then they consume more. There's not too many ways around that one. We can't bring people up into consciousness, and we can't bring people up into development without letting them act developed. They're going to want stuff. At least, most of us here probably don't live that extravagantly or conspicuously, but boy, are we comfortable compared to most people on the planet. And they're going to want at least what we want. There's no way around that, but we can bring down the number. One of the discussions in my book about what would be the optimum number was calculated literally on the back of an envelope by a guy who's now sitting down the road here in the executive office building. He's President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren. In the 1990s, he calculated how much carbon dioxide could the atmosphere tolerate without destabilizing, and then calculated how many people could be living at a fairly comfortable lifestyle, one that we would find acceptable and that a lot of people who are much poorer than we are would aspire to. He factored in maximum energy efficiency, which frankly we can do. It's without diminishing our lifestyle, we can become much more efficient. That it can be done, and it's cost effective too. And he came out with a number that was pretty much similar to that number of what I was talking about how many people could this planet support without force feeding it the food supply with chemicals. Somewhere between 1.5 to 3 billion people. I think that's the only way we're going to deal with this situation and become truly sustainable at all, because people naturally are going to want comfort. Every creature wants comfort. That's why they call it creature comforts. So it's not just about conspicuous consumption. It's really the inconspicuous consumption, the fact that we all need food and we all need energy, and that's really what we have to be concerned about. To do that, we simply do have to bring population down gradually and humanely and in a way that is culturally acceptable. Fortunately, I found out that that's actually possible. So.
Anybody else want to take on the big question? One more, and then we'll break.
Sorry, I guess pulling up on how do we pull down. I interview my students every year and have them fill out ecological footprint analyses. And invariably, Chinese students, Indian students, and African students are, if you believe the ecological footprint analysis as being viable, living within a level in which 7 billion of them, we would be doing okay. And these are not students that are impoverished, living in areas where they're not able to keep fed or things. They're participating in their economies. They're growing up in families that are affluent enough to be able to go to an international education. So at least as one metric, it seems like maybe it isn't quite as drastic. I look at this generation of my students, and they're not buying cars anymore. They've said it's too expensive to hold and maintain. I can car share, I can ride share, I can bike share. I don't need these resources. And when we project that out across the entire society, this is the first generation of students that have fewer percentage of driving permits than their parents here in the United States. We see that we're in a situation where people are making that transformation, that cultural transformation. And it may not be fast enough, may not be good enough, but it seems like there is some opportunity or options for optimism that's underreported in our media. We're always thinking about the crisis instead of, wow, what's the next new thing that's driving us towards a less consumptive society. And I just point out as a quick example, our energy use is down. I mean, we've been pretty much flat for the last several years. Our carbon intensity per capita and per dollar GDP in the United States has been declining for the last 20 years. We're now 15% under the carbon emissions per capita compared to 1990. So we're going in the right direction. I think the trick is to have the media help us say, these are the things that work. This is the culture that we need to be aiming towards, and not just, it's a crisis, everybody move around. Because as long as we're freaked out about the crisis, we get into fear mode instead of saying, hey, we've got some solutions that seem to be working, not just at the individual level, but at the mass scale that we really need to promote, not just individually, but through our culture that the media represents. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a one that some of these, many of the programs that the folks up here have worked with are trying to do. The Solutions Journalism Network, for one, and Pulitzer Center International Reporting Project, and BuzzFeed News, and as well as Alan's book. So thank you guys very much for spending the afternoon with us. I want to say, if you're interested in resilience, we're having another event tomorrow at noon here with some members of the Resilience Academy. We're going to talk about Bangladesh and Alaska, and as well as Clive Matunga is right here in the back. He's going to be here tomorrow as well. So please join us again if you can tomorrow. And I want to thank very much George Mason University, our colleagues also as well at the Brazil Institute, and the UN Foundation and USAID, and our panelists. Please give them a big hand, and please enjoy the reception. And as well as check out Alan's book outside, too. So thanks again.
Sorry, I fell into a coughing fit during one of your responses.
Unfortunately, they said your mic stopped at some point. That's why I had to give it the other one.